Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. In many ways, a good game is about balance. As a multimedia art form, and an interactive one at that, there are a whole lot of elements of a game clamoring for your attention all at once, and often striking a good balance between these elements for a given game is key to making it feel like a cohesive work. Today we're talking about one such issue of balance, specifically the balance between difficulty and immersion. Now these two elements of game design are not diametrically opposed, but they do affect one another, and we're here to talk about how and why. Now if you've followed video games for a while, then you're probably aware that, at risk of oversimplifying things, older games tended to be much more difficult. There are a number of reasons for this, including the simple fact that they were so simple by necessity that many things simply couldn't be explained, and everything is harder when you don't adequately know the rules. But if we're talking about design theory, there was also a major shift in game design principles that we've discussed in a previous episode. In short, older video games were designed primarily to challenge the player in interesting ways, but over time, game design aimed for more complex experiences that engrossed the player in more ways than that challenge. One of the more important products of this shift was paying more attention to the concept of immersion. That is, when you become so invested in the process of playing a game that you kind of zone into it. You feel like you're there, and you focus on the events of the game and your actions within it to the exclusion of everything that's actually around you. Now, immersion is something that happens to the player, not necessarily something the game does in and of itself. But over time, during this challenge experience shift, we started realizing that games could actively cultivate immersion. Immersion is a very complex topic. There are a lot of psychological elements to it. I don't have time to go into the entire thing, but today we're going to be specifically talking about how difficulty can contribute to or detract from immersion. One more note I should make is that immersion isn't necessarily important for every game to actively attempt to cultivate. When it comes down to it, if I'm just playing Star Wars with friends or shooting ships in Resogun, it's not all that important. But in many other games like Dark Souls, Assassin's Creed, Divinity, Original Sin, or Morrowind, it is pretty important, and this discussion becomes quite relevant. Like nearly all elements of game design, there is no absolutely right or wrong way to go about either of these topics. What's really immersive in Mass Effect would probably not work quite as well in Yoshi's Woolly World. But most games do have some level of challenge, and mismanaging its relationship to the attempts to build immersion in the game can have some unfortunate consequences. When playing a game, we actively ignore narrative development as we fail and retry. Whenever we fail, we erase that part of the story from our minds. We fail and retry as many times as necessary, but complete success is the only true narrative of our gameplay. But there is a limit to how much of that we can really take. Repeated failures can become very frustrating, and we end up losing our focus on the story and atmosphere of the game in an attempt to just beat this stupid boss, and if you're going for immersion, that's not really the best result. This is one of the reasons grinding in RPGs is so venomously hated. It shifts the focus from the story and world to a tedious attempt to overcome the game's challenges. But that can also happen the other way around. If a game is too easy, it can detract from the scale and the weight of the story and presentation. It's hard to believe the stakes are all that high when you're just blasting through enemies without any difficulty, and for that matter, it's kind of difficult to be immersed in something that you don't actually need to concentrate all that hard on. Balancing difficulty for immersion tends to be most effectively achieved when the game is difficult enough to require the player to utilize its mechanical complexities, but not difficult enough to be a grueling experience. Chrono Trigger, for instance, does this quite well. It would be really boring if you just had to hit the attack button all the time, but it would also be frustrating to die all the time. The game's difficulty is tuned, so you'll rarely have a really hard time of things, but you will still need to smartly utilize each character's abilities to succeed. This makes it so you do need to put out effort, and you do need to utilize all of the elements of the gameplay, so it does feel like a challenge, but it's generally not going to chew you up and spit you out until you throw the controller and leave the game behind forever. This concept can, of course, be pushed further in either direction, making easy games feel challenging enough to be engaging, and making difficult games feel motivating enough so as not to be frustrating. The key, in any case, is to find the right balance that works for a given game's goals, and that's usually accomplished by making sure that the gameplay is neither too frustrating nor too boring so as to get in the way of the world and the story. But it's not like difficulty can only have negative effects. Properly utilized, it can actually become a very powerful aid in creating atmospheric tension. The current king of this is probably the Souls series. The games create wonderfully dark, oppressive atmospheres through all facets of their design, but it's the difficulty that really pushes immersion through the roof. There's a wonderful moment in Demon's Souls, the tragically forgotten predecessor to the Dark Souls series, where you stand on a lift as it slowly lowers you through darkness and mist into a swamp of blood. And as I played this sequence and the horror of where I was going dawned on me, I realized I wasn't scared of what I would see down there. I was afraid that I would die down there. And this kind of difficulty as immersion is actually more common in modern games than you might think. It plays a major role in games from Alien Isolation to Minecraft to basically every roguelike ever made. In these instances, the consequences for failure are so high, or the reasons for failure so compelling, that the fear of failure becomes the major way that we become engaged with the events of the game. Of course, when it comes to making games, it's usually best to let the player choose their difficulty level, so this could be taken either as a principle of game design or simply as a way for you, the player, to cultivate your ideal experience in a game. When trying to build immersion through challenging gameplay, it basically comes down to making sure the mechanics increase your investment in the game without damaging your investment in the world and story the game puts you in. Add some great visuals, fitting music, and a world and story worth living in, and you'll have a game that'll grab you and never let go. If you have any input, feel free to talk about it in the comments, and make sure to click that subscribe button if you enjoyed the episode. There are also links to Games as Lit 101 on Facebook and Twitter in the description, as well as a link to Patreon, because making this show is a whole lot easier with your support. Next week, we'll be talking about how sometimes a choice that doesn't majorly change the events of a game can actually be more meaningful than the ones that do. And don't forget that in a few weeks, we'll be analyzing Hatoful Boyfriend, the famously strange dating sim about birds. So, until next week, class dismissed.